What we've described is how to get yourself ready for meditation by living a decent life, primarily. You need to. If you want to succeed regularly, let's put it that way, and you have an idea of getting your mind into some level of real concentration, and you need to think about the way you live to some extent. Now, Hong Kong's not southern Thailand by any stretch of the imagination. It seems to me to be quite a pressured place. So people trying to meditate successfully in this neck of the woods are perhaps going to have to make some adjustments to the way they live, more so than people living in a place like southern Thailand would. But we all have to do this to some degree. The Jewish Bible has the 10 Commandments, which point out to people how they should live as human beings. I don't know if there's any real form of practice associated with those things, but there is in Buddhism. The Buddhists have what they call precepts, or trainings in moral behavior. And moral behavior is not a goody-goody thing here. They're trying to point out to us in a very polite way how we should function as human beings, rather than the way we do normally. So some attention to the Buddhist precepts might be useful. It's the usual kind of thing, being careful about taking life, although it goes much deeper than that, but on the obvious level, swatting mosquitoes carelessly and things of that nature. Killing things is really something you should avoid. The whole precept, the first precept, is about non-harming, keeping yourself under control on the physical level. After all, life's precious. All things that have it want to keep it, of course. Not taking things that aren't given to you, so keeping your hands under control when there are things around which nobody much uses and which don't seem to have any particular use. I worked in offices in my time. And just, we tend to take pens and things without really thinking too much about it. On a very small level, I'm not saying there are any big thieves here, but we need to be aware that we have certain problems merely born from the way we live our lives, which cause us to behave in certain ways, which we need to bring under control. This is why the precepts exist, to try and get human beings to function a bit more normally. So not taking what is freely given is the usual Buddhist approach to the second precept. And relates mainly to monks. The wording relates to the monastic life. Monks are always being given things. They don't take anything that's not actually given to them. But it relates to worldly society too, taking what you've paid for. If things are on sale in shops, they have a price, you pay for it, then it's freely given to you. Things of that nature. Keeping sexual activity under some degree of control is also necessary. And that doesn't mean you can't indulge in such things, it just means keeping it within reasonable bounds. I mean, sexual activity is part of partnership, any partnership really. Buddhists aren't suggesting that people who live a normal kind of life, monk supporters if you like, support the monks and nuns, should behave like monks and nuns. But we should be careful how we approach sexuality. It is one of the great sources of stimulation for human beings. But it is a procreative activity, it has a use in nature. I don't think it was put together by nature to be enjoyed particularly, but to keep the species alive. Right speech, keeping speech under control, being English, then I'm quite sarcastic and rather good at that. So need to be aware of that, which I'm not always. Sometimes difficult to keep the tongue on the right track, as it were. But there's a right way to use speech. It's a mode of communication. We need to use it in the world. So we should be careful about causing offense or damage to people by using harsh language, perhaps being not too truthful. All these things need to be considered. The final precept is about not indulging in things that deliberately or intentionally cause the mind to function in abnormal ways. And that means alcohol mainly in the ancient days. The actual precept concerning mind-changing substances was linked mainly to alcoholic beverages. Again, it's not 1 or 2 beers or a glass of wine, even a glass of whiskey, come to that. It's taking things to excess. And often with people, it changes the personality completely, sometimes alcohol. My father was a good example of that. He was a charming man, but he wasn't imbibing, but he was totally different when he drank, and the results of it were disastrous for his marriage. So bearing that in mind, it also includes drugs. This doesn't strike me as a drug society too much, but they certainly exist in the world. A lot of people like to think that drugs help them to meditate, but this is an illusion, I'm afraid. They do quite the opposite. These things exist as a basis for human behavior. They're not goody-goody things. They don't make us into soft human beings or anything. Buddhists are just suggesting that we might like to investigate ourselves a little bit, investigate the religion, investigate the forms of morality, and see if we agree with the Buddha that this is the way we really should be trying to behave. Help your meditation practice, no end, that's for sure. Behaving in the way we normally do. I mean, the modern world encourages people to indulge in stimulating experiences, things that excite the mind. That's why consumerism exists, and why it's full of the things like films, movies, novels, all sorts of things that stimulate and excite. It's all about that. But you can't expect to get your mind to relax into concentration, which is designed to pacify the mind, to bring it to a nice peaceful state if you're filling your life with those kinds of activities. So the precepts are aimed at helping us to curb the way we live in the world, way we interact with the world. As a prelude, keep our physical life under control to some degree, and keep the way the mind is responding to life under some control also at the same time. As I said, they're not goody-goody things, so shouldn't be embarrassed about keeping them. They're sometimes made to sound that way, and morality in the West particular, the word morality is not much appreciated usually, particularly by the younger people, and by me. Of course, in my time, I felt the same way. Nobody wants much to strive to get their lives in order, but they like to meditate and then wonder why they're not successful as meditators. The result of meditation practice of this kind, it was designed by this gentleman, Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha. He didn't design it by sitting in a hotel room somewhere and working it all out intellectually. He actually did all this. So he probably made a lot of mistakes along the way. He retained the things that worked and disposed of the things that didn't. And what he came up with was a form of practice that would take an ordinary human being, like me, like anybody else, if they were willing to make the effort along the same road that he'd traveled along. What he became was a Buddha. A Buddha is not a god or a super normal human being. It's actually a perfect human being. A human being functioning, as the Buddhists tell us, as nature intended it should function. Something we are not capable of doing unless we do something about the state of our minds. The mind of a human being from birth develops, as does the body, of course. It develops in dependence on experience. So we're very much in the hands of other people as small children. We're fed certain kinds of experiences and encouraged to indulge in certain kinds of experiences also, which aren't always too good, I'm afraid, for our mental development. And so our mind develops, but not in a very skillful way. And we end up with a lot of anxiety and fear, loneliness, doubt, confusion in our lives. We can usually deal with it because human beings are quite good at dealing with these kind of things. We also have a society around us these days which is a reflection of ourselves in a sense, and which feeds us with the things that we can use to escape from the problems of life that we have and that come from the way we've been living it. One of the main problems, and one of the actual problems that needs to be addressed, and which the meditation practice was designed by Siddhartha Gautama to address, is the problem of self-belief. I mean, all people believe that they have a self, that there is a me living life. It's the most common belief of all. Very short word, I, me, but it's dominant in our lives and very dangerous. It brings a lot of problems our way, because if we believe there is a me living life, and the Buddhists deny this, by the way, completely, then of course life is happening to me. So the ups and downs of life, and the very fact that we're alive, and the fact that we always have to keep doing things to stay alive, the fact that we have to go to places we may not want to go to in order to get the necessities that we require to keep us alive. And the fact that there are things in life like pain and discomfort, and quite commonly so. Discomfort is present in our lives most of the time. Also, they're physical problems of being alive, which are common to all living things and to human beings also. If we think there's a me living life, then we also get a mental response to all of that. And it's not just a physical problem anymore. So if you get sick, of course, it's sickness in the body, which is one thing. And if you know about these things, you know this is not a great problem. It doesn't need to create mental problems. But with us, it tends to do that. The self-belief is the main problem as far as Buddhists are concerned. And this is what made the human being, if you like, the ordinary human being, Siddhartha Gautama, into the true human being, this thing they call the Buddha, by discovering the mechanism that created what he called the self-illusion, and thereby being able to destroy it completely. Once he did that, then he just had life. It was just life that, in the same way that every other living thing experiences it. The ups and downs of life were still there, but they didn't have the same effect on him mentally. And so his mind functioned on a very different level because of that. Now, in order to achieve that, to destroy the self, then you had to really experience the fact, first of all, that it was an illusion, and also the mechanism that sustained the illusion that there is a me living life. This is contentious, of course. If you've not heard this before, you might be wondering what's going on here. But it's the basis of Buddhism. The basic statement that the human being is what they call Anatta, void of anything you could call an abiding self, soul, spirit, or whatever word you want to use. But this is not an easy thing to accept, nor should it be accepted. It's something we can learn, we can experience. Meditation practice in the Buddhist sense is designed to do this very thing. The more we practice, the more the insight, as they call it, arises, until eventually the insights that arise are full and complete. And the full and complete insight is into the nature of what a human being isn't, rather than what a human being is. We have no need to know precisely what we are, according to Buddhism. All we really need to know is what we aren't. And most of us believe, of course, if all of us will believe this, that there is a me living life, and it's not an easy thing to deal with. I think the younger you are, the more easy this will be. Now, this is the basic Buddhist point. So the whole practice that Siddhartha Gautama put together and succeeded with was for this very reason. The first 4 steps of it will prepare the mind on a certain level for this kind of experience to arise fully and completely, for the experience of the truth of what's actually living life to occur on a full and complete level. It won't arise from the first 4 steps, nor from the second 4 steps, but it will arise after you've completed the third 4 steps of anapanasati. I'm not saying you would do that, neither have I described them. It's not necessary for me to do that. Anybody who makes the first 4 steps of the practice work and can do it regularly will also need to garner some knowledge of Buddhist ways and means, Buddhist terminology, the philosophy and psychology of Buddhism, and should have a sufficient understanding to know precisely what they're doing and why because of that. So I'm not going to go into detail on the third and fourth steps of the third and fourth levels of anapanasati, although we can look briefly at the 4th level and the enlightening experience itself. It's simply a matter of seeing things as they are. And normally the mind is not in a condition to do that. It's conscious in a subjective way, or we are conscious in a subjective way, because we have self-belief. We're always experiencing the world, but as long as we think there's a me living it, then it's a very lopsided form of experience. And the world to us is full of concepts that we believe are real, represent the reality of the world we experience. And the main concept is that this is me. We believe that this is me, then when we look at a tree, for instance, we think the tree is the actual reality of what we're experiencing. But tree is a word, a concept. It has no meaning. We develop a whole value system which is based on illusion, according to Buddhists, and it comes from the basic misunderstanding of our own true nature. We think there's a me living life, and then everything we experience becomes a reflection of that misunderstanding. So the whole point of the practice was to get the mind into a condition so it could contemplate, first of all, the actual living human being itself, and particularly the mind of the human being, the thing we call the mind, because this is where all the problems occur, of course. But to do that, you have to do quite a lot of practice if the experience is going to be full and complete. But it will depend very much on how you feel about meditation, how you feel about your life. Most people will probably use meditation practice just to generate some peace of mind, become a little more what they call mindful of the processes of being alive, so we can control our responses to life more easily, and therefore have less anger, less irritation, less depression, less anxiety, less fear, etc. These are all mental states that arise easily with human beings because we really aren't clever enough or bright enough mentally to be able to stop them from arising. But by practicing meditation, you can develop this magical thing called mindfulness, which is all about being able to pay attention to things as they happen in the present moment. Like cutting bread, for instance, or even putting butter on a slice of bread, you can do it mindfully, so that your mind isn't thinking about something else at the same time, but you're actually focused on the thing you're experiencing. If you can develop this skill in the first 4 steps of anapanasati, develop it very well indeed, and very easily because of the nature of the first 4 steps of the practice, then it's going to make your life a lot more comfortable to live, a lot easier to live, a lot more of a peaceful experience. You'll become more mindful, even if you never concentrate the mind to any degree. It won't really matter. What you will develop is the ability to be more aware of the way you live life, and to be able to respond, therefore, to the experiences of life in a wiser, more controlled way. But the ultimate aim is to experience truth, what they call Dhamma, the truth of a human being, particularly the truth of what we are, and so that we can put an end to self-belief, if we're inclined to do that, and therefore destroy all the unnecessary mental stress and tension that we otherwise are going to have to experience right to the end of our lives. And this is what Siddhartha Gautama did. So what is it? Self-belief? There's something underlying it, some basic misunderstanding that all human creatures have concerning their own nature and the nature of the world they live in. The Buddha pointed out that the main source of the problem of self-belief comes from a very basic misunderstanding concerning the actual nature of what we are and what the world we live in is. We look outside us and what we see is a world full of things. The illusion of matter is very strong with human beings. You might find that a strange statement also, because physics, experimental physics, has been trying to find the building blocks of matter since time immemorial. According to Buddhists, they never will, because there's no such thing as a thing, odd though that sounds. There's no stability, there are no stable, complete objects in this world. There are only things in process, in constant motion. If you look in the world outside, you see this everywhere. You watch nature work its wonders, it works them in cycles. Nothing comes to perfection, it's always coming into existence. A tree grows, but it never reaches perfection. It grows and then it reaches a point where it begins to ungrow itself. It begins to deteriorate, eventually disappear. All things are the same. Every single thing that exists in this universe arises, develops, passes away. It's like a thing in process, but there are no things, there are no stable objects that don't change and transform with time. The human body is a good example. You have to feed all the time. You can't just feed once, you have to keep on doing it. You can't just drink water, you can't drink anything once, you have to keep on doing it. You can't just sleep once, you have to repeat the process every day just to stay fit and healthy, and so on and so forth. You put food into the body, it doesn't just stay there, it goes into the body, it's processed by the body. If the organs of the body process the food, take the ingredients out, the chemicals and proteins out that are necessary to keep the human body functional and fit. So you put something in this end, it goes right down through the body, and the waste product goes back into nature to be reused in some way by the forces of nature. When you look at it in that way, you see the human being as being part of nature rather than separate from it, which tends to be how we consider ourselves. But we depend on nature like everything else. We process things in the same way that nature processes things. Every living thing functions in the same way. Every plant functions in the same way. It arises, it develops, it passes away. All things are like this. There's a basic problem with human beings, given our lack of understanding of what we are. We seek happiness. All things do. But we seek happiness in a very strange way. We want to be stimulated, excited. Ordinary happiness is not sufficient for us. The reason we seek happiness, of course, is because stability is a requirement in our lives. It's the very cause, it's the reason it's the thing we need more than anything else to feel secure and stable in the way within our own being. Otherwise it's very difficult to feel anything but unhappy. But human beings seek happiness continually, so it's quite easy for us to project the illusion of stability into ourselves and into the world outside us. It's easy for us to believe that the body, well, we know it's not going to last forever, but it is somehow a permanent thing. It's here, it's more or less the same all the time. Okay, it ages and it changes, but it's still somehow something. And we do the same thing with the world outside us. We know it changes and transforms. We can allow for that. But at the same time, we have a belief that everything is going to be more or less the same until the end of time. We look outside at the stars in the sky, we think there'll always be the same constellations, the same stars. There's absolutely no reason why that should be. We see the sun rise and set every day and probably assume that it will go on forever and ever in the same old way. But the solar system is not a stable object. It's not anything. It's something in motion, and it's prone to influences from outside sources. Things enter the solar system all the time and cause disturbance, cause perturbation, sometimes cause quite disastrous results. There are obvious signs in the past that this planet has changed its axis of rotation. Undoubtedly it has, and a great number of times, because it's been influenced by large bodies passing close to it. We can look at the cosmos and see a nice pattern of stars in the sky and the Milky Way floating over the zenith above us and feel quite secure in that. And that's fine, but we shouldn't be too fooled by it. Everything changes, even the universe, even the solar system, even the world we live on. There are earthquakes quite often these days, typhoons, all sorts of disturbances, meteorological disturbances. The planet is a living thing. It's not one solid, nice, like a billiard ball that never moves. It's constantly changing and flexing. The core of it is still hot. Volcanoes still erupt occasionally. There are all sorts of natural disturbances. You should be aware of this, because the illusion that we live on something called the planet Earth is very strong, and somehow this planet will always be the same. You get the same belief projected into the divisions on the surface of the planet that we call countries. Countries come and go. It might take a long time for them to happen. But the sort of places and divisions on the planet Earth that existed 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, most of them have disappeared. Most of those empires that grew up, they passed away. The British Empire was very strong in its day. Now it doesn't exist. The country called England still exists, but there's no guarantee that that small part of the planet Earth will always be called England and will always be populated by people who speak English. Nothing is certain. But we think it is, because that's the basis of our happiness. We have to have something we can rely on, but there really is nothing in nature that is reliable. Now this is coming slowly, but surely, to the basic truth of the human mind, because this is the source of all the problems. There cannot be self-belief if we experience ourselves properly as a process of change and transformation. It sounds like a strange statement to describe a human being in this way, as something which changes continually. Yet a little observation surely would prove that. And this is probably where the soul theory comes from, and certainly the idea there is a permanent self. It's a desperate attempt to cover over the cracks and to keep the illusion of permanence or stability alive. As long as we think there is something here called a body and something inhabiting it or floating around it or associated with it in some way, something called a mind, and then we can also believe that this is me. The body is not so important. The mind is the bit that needs to be, the code that needs to be cracked. Now, according to Buddhists, the mind does not exist in the way we think it does. And this is the great insight. This is what made the human being, Gautama, into the true human being they call the Buddha, because it destroys the illusion of self, takes away its platform, removes the base, and the self can no longer exist because the truth of the mind has been revealed. It's actually a reaction to sense experience. That is, we think there's always a me, and therefore always a mind which is waiting to experience the things that come in through the senses. We see, we hear, we smell, we taste, we touch, and we think and we imagine, etc., etc. And all this happens in this thing which is somewhere in here, which is always the same, which was there at birth, and which will experience death in some way. The same mind, something called the mind. All these experiences happen to this thing. But in actual truth, if you experience the basic truth of the mind itself, And the practice of meditation is designed to allow you to do this by getting the mind itself into a condition so it can observe itself functioning. And it's going to discover, or we are going to discover, that the mind is something which really does not exist in the true sense. It isn't anything. It's a series of electrical impulses, reactions to sense experience. Now, whenever you see anything with your eyes, the actual thing you're going to see will be a creation of the mind itself. The mind will create the image that you're experiencing. That sounds odd, but this is the way the mind works. We can never really directly experience anything in the world which we say is outside of us. We can see trees, we can see clouds, but what the mind actually responds to is not the physical reality that exists in the world, but an image the mind creates to work with. The mind always works this way. It creates images or reflections of things, because the mind, or consciousness if you like, being the same thing, is reflective. It kind of reflects things. Because it's reflective, it can create the image we call the mind. The concept of mind comes from the mind. And it's the mind with ignorance that then believes that the concept is the reality, that there really is something called the mind. Being able to do that, it can also create the illusory self and believe that that is real too. Keep this on a more understandable level, we could say that we, in our ignorance, create the concept mind and believe that that is the reality of the thing we call the mind. There really is something inside us, which is always there, called a mind. And that's what we need to see the truth of. And if we get this thing we call the mind into perfect condition, build up its muscles, polish it up, so it can function properly, then it can experience correctly. I just mentioned that the mind itself creates the images that we experience when we see anything, but it does that with all experience. Although it's not too easy to deal with that, but when you hear music, what you're hearing is something the mind has created from these raw sounds or vibrations of the air that we call music, which are occurring outside. They hit the eardrum, and then the mind receives that information and makes sense of it. The mind is basically feeling, perception, and thought. Perception is the process of recognition. When you feel anything, then the mind reacts with perception immediately. It's like a process of cause and effect. Something enters the ear, a musical sound, that goes to the mind. When it goes to the mind receives it and immediately creates a feeling as a response. And the feeling then causes the process of perception to begin perceiving or scanning. While it's doing this, it's creating an image, building a kind of reaction or image to what's being heard. So the music we hear is actually being created inside of us, as we would say, rather than outside. And because the mind works this way, everything it experiences, every thought, every imagination, every physical experience is going to be created in this way, or recreated. The word the Buddhists use to describe the thing that is created, the image the mind creates, is aramana. So we never experience anything directly. We're always experiencing mental images of things. Now this is fine if the mind is working properly. It's pure and can reflect nature as it really is. But the mind is always distorted by self-belief, and is further distorted by our approach to life and the way we've lived since we were small children. And so the images we're constantly experiencing are always distorted in a subjective way. And so when the mind contemplates itself, when it thinks about itself, then it comes up with an image which is not accurate. It comes up with something which exists, which is something which is called the mind. A permanent existing reality of nature which is somehow in here somewhere and which is always here. And in dependence on that, it can then create the illusion that this thing is me. Now, if the mind is working perfectly, it can experience the truth of itself quite easily. In fact, it will do that quite naturally. And when it does that, it will recognize that the basic truth of this thing called the mind is that it doesn't really exist outside of sense experience. When we hear music, the mind that responds, that hears the music, that responds to it, that enjoys it, that doesn't like it or whatever, actually comes from the experience. And before that happened, that mind did not exist. There is no permanently existing thing called the mind. Every single experience that we've ever had since the time we were first born has been created in the same way by the experiences we've undergone. All those trillions of experiences, each individual one has created a mental reaction that we will call the mind. Well, no food this time. All right. Okay. It's been created by the thing called the mind. So the insight is into the nature of the human mind. I don't know how much of this you can grasp if you've not heard it before. It's not that difficult if you've been dealing with it. And the insight is the essence of what made a Buddha from an ordinary human being. Insights arise all the time during the course of life to certain kinds of people. Some people never get them, although they meditate for years. Some do. If they don't meditate, they experience strange events that are called insight. What I've just described is the insight that takes an ignorant human being all the way into a perfect human being. But the basis, the thing you need to experience, is the basic truth of what we think is the essence of us. Now, to do that, you need to see the truth of how the mind works, that it really isn't anything. It's a reaction to sense experience, which is continually coming and going, and it depends entirely on experience taking place. We have to see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and think and imagine. Otherwise, the mind will simply not exist. And it never exists as anything. It's like a series of flashes of electricity. It always works in the same way. Whenever there's a sense experience, there's a feeling arising in the mind towards it. Feeling of pleasure or displeasure. There's a perception arising, a process of perception. Perception is like a scanner. Perception is what recognizes things. So when you look at me, you recognize me as a monk or whatever, as an Englishman, a human being, depending on how you perceive me. This is what perception, the more you look at me, the more you listen to them, the more impressions you will form. The more perception will scan, the more information it will pick up. When we perceive, we then think about what we perceive. This is the way the mind works. And over all that, experiencing all those different functions of the mind, all the feelings, all the perceivings, all the thinking that's going on, is consciousness itself, the process that we call consciousness. There is nothing there which is a permanent, stable, abiding thing. Even consciousness comes and goes all the time. It's like little packets of energy. And meditation is designed to reveal this basic truth of a human being. Sounds fantastic, I know. Now this is what anapanasati, or any meditation worth its salt, is ultimately all about. Not saying you want to do this, or even be interested in it remotely, but it's ultimately the cause of why there is a practice called anapanasati, and why there is a Buddha, and why there is anything called Buddhism in this world. Of course, we can use our meditation for whatever we want. But this is the ultimate aim of meditation, is to reveal the basic truth of what the Buddhists call anicca. They just use one word. All anicca means is impermanence. And what it reveals, what it points out, is that everything changes. And to experience the basic truth of the mind as a flowing process of nature, a reaction to sense experience, something that comes and goes continually. This is the way to full enlightenment. Nothing is stable, nothing is going to remain the same for really one moment to the next. Even science can tell us this. We don't need to get our minds into perfect order to have this kind of understanding. Physics has been working on the borders of reality for a long time, but they'll never get to the heart of the problem. You cannot use machinery to do that. Only the human mind can understand this, can accept this kind of information. Only the human mind is able to develop what they call insight as a result of its efforts to perfect itself. And this is what the Buddha did. This is the aim of anapanasati, because it then brings you into contact with the basic Buddha's teaching. What Siddhartha Gautama spent his life teaching was the basic truth of what a human being is, what the world we live in is. And so the insight, the end product of the practice of anapanasati is to arrive at that basic truth. But the Buddha taught a lot of things, a lot of information, which we can also look at over the next 2 or 3 days. Because there are other things to understand about a human being, about the world, the universe we live in and experience. This is the basic truth, that everything changes and transforms. But what changes and transforms also has other significant effects on the way we function, for instance. Because if something changes and transforms, if it's what the Buddhists call anicca, like a human being, for instance, there's a process of nature, not anything, always changing and transforming, always having to renew itself, always having to rebuild its energies, always having to do the things it needs to do to get the material that helps it to rebuild its energies, to get its food and sustenance, and so on and so forth. And it's constantly doing things, constantly having to act just to stay alive. Anything that changes and transforms, according to Buddhism, is also prone to what they call dukkha. A dukkha is always unpleasant, but on very different levels. It depends on the kind of dukkha we're talking about. On the basic level of nature, then everything that changes is dukkha. This is true of animals as it is of human beings, and is said to be true of anything that changes. We don't need to get too far off the beaten track here. We can stay with things that have life, have perception, have thought, have feeling, because most organic things do to some level or other. But particularly the things we call animals and human beings have these kind of abilities in abundance, human beings in particular. Because our lives are changeful, because we are ourselves a changeful process of nature, if you like, then we're prone to experience discomfort, pain, we're prone to get old, we're prone to die sooner or later. And we're always going to have to do the things necessary to stay alive. And one of the most basic translations of dukkha is as pain itself, in which case the word used is dukkha, dukkha, two dukkhas. And that's such an obvious form of dukkha that they give it two dukkhas to stress it. Everybody experiences pain, so you know dukkha on that level. And you know it as a child, even as a baby perhaps, when mummy sticks a safety pin into your bum when she's changing your nappy. There's discomfort. Everybody experiences discomfort. It's very common in life. You can't just, for instance, stay in one position for too long. If you're sitting down waiting for something in a place, you'll be moving quite a lot, because your body experiences quite naturally discomfort. It settles down. And then the feeling of being comfortable and sitting in a certain position means you have to shift your position a little bit to get the feeling of comfort to return. This is simply because the body is not anything. It's a kind of squishy process. And so if you sit for long enough, the whole thing settles down. And weight then brings stress onto certain parts of the body in contact with the floor, for instance. There's also the fact of unsatisfactoriness of life to be concerned, we need to be concerned with, because this is very common and very obvious when you think about it. We've already mentioned it. This is a very obvious form of what the Buddhists call dukkha, because it is always unpleasant, not necessarily on a painful level or a profound level, but we're always experiencing dissatisfaction. You might eat a meal, but how long do you feel satisfied for? And then when you start to feel hunger again, that's a form of dukkha, because dissatisfaction is arising. The body feels dissatisfied. The body can feel dissatisfied. It's telling you a story, giving you a certain response. Get me some more food. I'm starting to lose energy. Life is full of this. Whatever we experience, it cannot satisfy us completely. This is a very basic form of dukkha. Whatever changes and transforms continually, which is true of a human being as it is of anything, also experiences dukkha continually on some level. And this is a very natural level of dukkha, not one you can get rid of, and not one you should even try to get rid of. It's impossible. It's simply life. The up and down process of life, the day-to-day experiences of life, naturally are changeful. Naturally they produce dukkha on the various levels. What is changeful, transformative, and is prone to dukkha is also, say the Buddhists, without anything you could call a self, a soul, a spirit, or anything like that. This is somewhat contentious, of course, because we like to believe there is something about us which will continue. I was brought up in the Christian tradition, although not directly. There was quite a lot of liberality, quite a lot of ignorance also. I never believed in a soul because I never gave it any consideration. I never believed in a spirit. I certainly believed that it was a me living life, up until a certain point in my life, that is. But according to Buddhists, there is no such thing, inhabiting a human being, hovering around it, dominating it, making it work. They claim that the human being is purely and simple anatta. It is void of anything you could call an abiding self-principle. That doesn't mean there's nothing inside a human being which you could make a mistake about and think was a self, because the fact that we believe that this is me has to come from some source. Okay, we don't have the right information, our minds aren't really clear enough to understand ourselves properly, but there has to be something that, based on which we can make a mistake and believe that this is me. And this is generally assumed by Buddhists who think about this stuff to be a survival instinct, because all living things have such a reaction to nature that you could call a survival instinct. And it is selfish, it has a low-level feeling of self associated with it. Otherwise we wouldn't be selfish enough to stay alive. We have to compete sometimes for sustenance, at least animals do rather more than human beings do. We just need to buy it. But there is always this self-belief, or this very low level of self, which you could call, and some Buddhists do, a survival instinct. And given the human ability to think and conceive, that is, imagine, and it's quite easy for us, given our intellectual capabilities, to imagine that this feeling, this abstract feeling, this survival instinct, because it does feel, it does have a selfish taint to it, is me. And this is considered by some to be the source of the problem. The simple fact that we cannot experience ourselves truly. Our minds are never in a real condition to do that. And so we come up with this theory, this trisadia, as the minds call it, as the Thais call it, this mistaken understanding of our own nature. It has a source. But all things are like this, not just human beings. All things, according to Buddhists, are void of self in truth. It's doubtful that animals create the same problem that human beings do. Whether they can do that or not is debatable. I've watched monkeys quite a lot in recent times because I've been living quite close to them. And they're intelligent, there's no doubt about that, more intelligent than any other animal I've ever seen. Because when you throw a rock at them, they hide behind trees. They know that brings them some degree of safety. They don't just run away to get out of range. They actually go and hide behind a tree because they know if they do that, the rock can't do them any harm. And they do exhibit traits that do seem to indicate some degree of what we might call egotism or self-belief. But I think it's really only human beings that are capable of sustaining the illusion of being me throughout a lifetime, if indeed it is an illusion. That's something for us to play around with ourselves and perhaps try and find out the truth of by using meditation practice. We just touched a little bit on Buddhist philosophy, the basis of Buddhism, that all things are changeful, transformative, so there really aren't any things ultimately, and this is the main insight at the end of the meditative path for people inclined to pursue it. Now, there aren't too many who make, I'm afraid, get all the way. Insight is a flash of inspirational insight into the truth of things, which kind of illuminates the human landscape in such a way that everything is clear and distinct. It might only happen once, but it's probably sufficient in some cases. Once is enough. Everything that is impermanent, changeful, is therefore prone to dukkha, say the Buddhists, simply because it does change and transform. The most basic form of dukkha, the one we need to be aware of, is that unsatisfactory nature of life, simply because it changes all the time. We can never experience full satisfaction. And because we have self-belief, because the third of the characteristics of reality, according to Buddhists, that all things that change and transform and are prone to dukkha are also void of anything you could call an abiding self. Because we miss that one, as we miss the others, then we make a problem out of life. We believe there is something permanent here about a human being. Perhaps we might project a soul or a spirit idea, something that lives on after death, something that was alive before this life and brought certain meanings and reactions and reflections of previous lives into this life. We're what we are because of what we've been in some past life. You might have this belief through our ignorance of what the Buddhists call Anatta. But the main problem with being ignorant of Anatta and of dukkha itself, of the true nature of life and of the changeful nature of life, is that we get a lot of mental problems we don't need to have. We believe there's a me living life. We ignore the basic truth of Anicca in order to do that, ignore the basic truth of Anatta also, ignore the basic nature of life, so we end up with a lot of mental disturbance, which is also called dukkha. So there are two basic levels of dukkha. One you can do something about, and you can do something about it by simply destroying self-belief. One you can't do anything about because it's simply nature, but which you can learn to deal with, and you can deal with more easily by developing yourself as a meditator. So what do you want me to do? Tell a few jokes?
Yeah, if you've got any good jokes.
Only dirty ones.